Okay, welcome everyone to this last part of a lecture covering the first chapter of the book. Okay, so far in all the other lectures, we have come across starting from things, property, from things and property, we go to a person and the action of a person, the juristic legal actions of a person. Now, with actions of the person, we would of course come to this concept called right, because it is only from the acts or actions of a person that right or rights arises. So this is something that is covered or talked about in every class. In fact, almost every minute of every class in a law subject, not just my subject, not just this subject. All right. When you talk about right in law, there is, in general, two types of rights. Okay, I put it out here. One is what is known as a personal right. And another one is what is known as a real right. In Thai, personal right they call สิทธิส่วนบุคคล Real right in Thai they call it subsidy. Okay. Now, I have to start with talking about how each of these rights arises. Okay, then you can see the difference between the two. But before I go there, bear in mind that the opposite view or the opposite perspective of right is duty. Duty. Alright, or in the Thai legal language, they use the word obligation. One person's right create for another person an obligation. Alright, so say for example, in a sale and purchase contract, the seller has the right to request for the purchaser to pay up the purchase price. The seller has the seller has the right to tell the purchaser to pay up for the purchase price. The purchaser has the duty to pay for the purchase price. Alright, one person's right would create on another person a duty. Okay, let's talk about these two kinds of rights in law. Personal right and real right. Personal right or สิทธิส่วนบุคคล. As in the book it says, it's the right to do an action, right, or not do an action. Or sometimes they use the word refrain from doing an action. Refrain from doing an action. How does the personal right arise? A personal right arises from a juristic act. For you guys, business students, the most basic kind of a juristic act in which you can get a personal right or in which a personal right arises is from the juristic act of a contract. when a contract is born, or when a contract is formed, or in Thai they call การเกิดสัญญา then it would create the right for one party, the personal right for one party. Like in the example I just gave, a sale contract creates the right for the seller to request for the purchaser to pay up the purchase price. At the same time, it creates on the purchaser a duty or an obligation to pay for the purchase price. Alright? Okay, this is the most common way in which สิทธิส่วนบุคคล or personal right can come in international business or in any kind of a business situation. Alright? Now, because it is a personal right, this right can be used, or to use the legal word for it, binding. Binding on, or can be used on only the contractual parties. What does it mean here? What it means is that the personal right that is born or arises from a contract can only be used between the parties to the contract only. So say for example a sale and purchase contract, this personal right is only used between the seller and the buyer, the seller and the purchaser. The seller and the purchaser are the contractual parties. It cannot be used, the personal right cannot be used on any other person besides the contractual parties. Besides, in our example, the seller and the purchaser, nobody else can use this personal rights or it's binding on. So this personal right is only relevant, to put it very simply, the personal right is only relevant or linking or binding on the two parties to the contract only. Or in Thai they call บังคับเฉพาะผู้สัญญาเท่านั้น Alright? In comparison, let me put a black pen here, a black line here to distinguish. You can see clearly. In comparison with a real right or subsidy, a real right, or as the name says in Thai, subsidy is a right in property. Now, this right does not come or doesn't get born or does not arises from a juristic act like a contract. No. It doesn't arises from a juristic act. Right? It arises according to what the law says. What I mean is, if the law says if you do X, Y, Z, if one person do X, Y, Z, and then you get the real right, and that person go and actually do X, Y, Z, then that person gets the real right. Right? Say, give a practical example. Say, for example, okay, I'll put here an example. Okay, I put provision of the law, which means the real right comes from what the law says. Provision or provided by the law. So, for example, in a sale of land contract, In the sale of land contract, the law actually provides, so the law actually says that the contract of a sale of land must be made in writing. It must be a written contract. Alright? And it's not only it must be writing, it has to be signed. I write the keyword here. It has to be signed by the seller and the purchaser. And the sale of land contract must be registered. Where? Registered where? At the land office. And according to the provision of the law, according to what the law says, if the law says that if you do this and this, you get a right in property. If you don't do this and this, as what the law provides, you don't get a right in property. So you see, the real right doesn't come from any kind of juristic act, as in this case, a contract. No. Not any two parties of a contract come together to make a juristic act and then they have a real right. No. A real right comes from following the steps of what the law says. If the law says if you do X, Y, Z, as in this case, the sale of land contract must be in writing and signed, it must be registered. And if you do this too, you get the real right. If you don't do this too, it has to be both. If you do either one, you don't get the real right. You have to do two to get the real right, because that's what the provision of the law says. As compared to this, it's two parties coming together to make a contract. It's just a juristic act between two parties. Here, there are certain clear provisions set down by the law on a certain situation. I give you the example of sale of land contract. Another one could be a mortgage contract. A mortgage contract is the same requirements provided by the law. A mortgage contract must be in writing, it must be signed, it must be registered. A mortgage contract, sanya jamnong. Alright, where you put up your immovable thing as a guarantee for money you borrowed. For a mortgage contract, you must follow these two steps set by the law, provided by the law, and if you do this too, you get a real right in property. There's something else that is very importantly different from a personal right, and that is binding on. In the personal right, it is binding. The personal right is binding on only the contractual parties. A real right is binding on two groups of people. One is, of course, the contractual parties. And there is another group. Everyone else. Everyone else. Which means everybody else in the world. Yes, you heard me correct. Everybody else in the world, besides the contractual parties, have to be binding to this real right. The real right is not only binding to the contractual parties only. No. It is binding on the contractual parties, as here, and, have to add the word and. It is binding on everyone else in the world. Alright, to give you a typical example, coming back here. the real right in property, in this case, from the purchase of the land. Alright? If the sale of land contract is done according to what is provided in the law, alright, which is in writing, signed, and then registered. If it's done according to what is provided in the law, okay, the person who bought the land, the purchaser who bought the land from the sale of land contract, has the real right. This real right is binding on the contractual party, which means that the real right is binding on the person who bought, who sold the land to the purchaser. But it's not only that. It's not only that. It is also binding on you and me. So let's say Mr. A bought the land from Mr. B. Mr. A bought a plot of land from Mr. B. The real right is binding not only on Mr. A and B. It is also binding on you and me and everyone else in the world. How does it work? Mr. A, who is the new owner of the land because Mr. A bought the land from Mr. B, would have the right to say, for example, to me, to get out of his land. Let's say I walked on Mr. A's land. Mr. A can say to me, hey, David, get the hell out of my land. And I cannot say to him, who are you? I'm not your contractual party. You have no right to order me to get out of your land. No, no. Mr. A has the right. Mr. A has the real right to tell me to get out of the land, even though I am not a contractual party. B is Mr. A's contractual party. But nevertheless, A has the right, the real right, to tell me to get out from the land. Because the real right is binding on everyone else in the world. In comparison with this, a personal right which is binding only on the contractual parties. Now this part, very important. Let me tell you where it is in the book, just in case you haven't looked at it yet. It's on pages 9 and 10 of the book. Pages 9 and 10 of the book on right. Alright, this is pretty much everywhere in the world. You would have these two kinds of rights. Alright, the distinction is here in green and red. That's all I have to say for this part, and I think this concludes what is in that first chapter of my book.